Hey, welcome to Haphazard Homestead. I'm Holly Chris. I'm glad you're here. I love pokeweed. I love to eat pokeweed. It's one of my most favorite wild edible greens. It's in my top 3 wild edible greens for summertime eating, and it's probably in my top 5 for wild edible greens of any time of the year. There's so much misunderstanding and confusion that I see on the internet and here on YouTube about pokeweed that I hope I can convince you by the end of this video to get to know pokeweed and enjoy it as much as I do. It's real food for regular people. And I want to make one thing clear. I'm just talking in this video about the pokeweed greens, the shoots and the leaves. I'm not going to say anything about the roots except that they are not for regular eating or drinking at all. And I'm not going to talk about eating the flowers or the berries either. I'm just focused on the pokeweed greens. And that's enough because picking and preparing pokeweed requires some attention. It's not complicated, it just takes some attention. If you cook spaghetti noodles or other pasta, you have all the skills you need to cook a good mess of pokeweed greens. I think it's a lot easier than grilling a chicken. There's a lot to go over with pokeweed, so I hope you'll stick with me throughout this whole video. I'm going to start off by just trying to explain how good pokeweed is. In the second part, I'm going to be down in Arkansas with my dad, who's been eating pokeweed for a long time. We'll be picking and cooking up a mess of pokeweed that's really good from an older plant, not what you might hear of from many places. And then in part 3, I'm going to provide a strategy for how to get to know pokeweed all through the year and be ready to use it at every stage that you might want to eat the greens. All right, so how am I going to convince you that pokeweed is that good to eat? I learned to pick and eat pokeweed from my dad. He's in his 80s now, and he learned from his grandmother. So he's been picking and eating pokeweed for a long time. It's one of his favorite wild greens too. I can remember my dad pulling over on the side of a country road and having us 3 girls fill up grocery sacks full of pokeweed. And it was great to eat. One of the amazing things about poke is that it can feed families, big families, from the spring all the way through the summer. It's filling food, it's good food. So you don't have to take my word for it. How about the words from some other people? How about the words from Euell Gibbons, one of the real masters of wild edible foods? He's eaten a lot of pokeweed in his time. And let's take a look at what Billie Jo Tatum says. She's from the Ozarks. She has eaten a lot of pokeweed in her time too, and guaranteed she knows a lot of other people who eat pokeweed for real food too. Euell Gibbons says here that pokeweed is probably the most well-known and widely used wild vegetable in North America. So how about Billie Jo Tatum? She says that after the dandelion, that pokeweed is probably one of the most well-known wild edible plants. She also says that it's a mild plant and far more delicious than most garden vegetables. How about that? With all of the misinformation and confusion about this plant that I've seen and heard, it's clear that pokeweed is not the most well-known wild vegetable in America anymore. And that's a shame. I hope we can change that, you and me. Here on YouTube, there are some people who've picked and eaten a lot of pokeweed, and they've used it to feed their families for a long time. So I've made a little playlist with their videos from Brenda over at Homesteading the Pioneer Way, and from Billie Jo Smith on OCO TV that's put out by the Cherokee Nation, and then from Al Fritsch from Earth Healing. They all have eaten a lot of pokeweed and know pokeweed well through real experience. So when you're done here, you may want to go over and look at the rest of that playlist. And if that doesn't convince you, well, then how about just people buying pokeweed in the grocery store? For a long time, cans of poke greens were sold in grocery stores all across the United States. It was a popular green. And the only reason they stopped selling it was because not enough people were bringing it in, gathering it in the wild, and bringing it to their processing plant. I'll tell you more about that when we get to the section of this video that's about strategies for finding and using pokeweed yourself. So let's head to Arkansas and get to picking some pokeweed. Pokeweed is not just delicious, it's a beautiful landscaping plant too. My dad likes it so much that he planted some by the deck and kitchen window so he and my mom can look at it. He started by moving roots from a plant that was 4 or 5 years old. Then he let it all grow a few years to get strong. The plant on the right is about 20 years old now, but the one on the left is a lot more recent. Pokeweed will naturally branch like you see on the right on the big old healthy plants. What my dad is doing is cutting off the major branches, and then we'll harvest the leaves to eat from those branches. Cutting those branches will force new fresh leaves to start growing so he and my mom can eat those too later on. I want to point out that it was almost 100 degrees while we were doing this, and that highlights one reason pokeweed is such a great food plant.
Now we'll harvest the best leaves out of that bag.
It can handle a lot of summer heat and still be producing a lot of food. This is in late June, so you can see a few flower clusters up toward the top of this big shrub if you look close. That's okay.
This happens every year with this plant, and it doesn't seem to bother.
But my dad does keep the plant cut back so it never gets any mature seeds. That way, kids, birds, raccoons, and other animals are not going to be messing with the poke berries.
So this will ensure another harvest of new growth in the axils of the lower leaf. Now here's a lower leaf. There's the new growth coming out of the axil of the leaf. See, everywhere there's a new growth. We'll harvest that. And that won't take long. That'll be ready to go again in probably 2 weeks.
Now, a lot of folks will say to only eat plants that are 6 inches high or 8 inches or less than a foot tall, but that's not the important distinction. And that's not what the canning companies did either. You can see here where Yule Given says people should be chary of eating foliage after it's fully developed. That chary just means cautious. People should be cautious.
That's it. We get to look at it every time we do dishes. I like to take the big leaves. You take the big leaves off, and separate. There's a lot of vegetation there.
The key is to focus on actively growing plants and actively growing parts. Pokeweed has a lot of chemical compounds in it. In healthy, actively growing leaves, one set of compounds are water soluble, like the saponins in yucca flowers that I've shown you how to eat before.
Well, that's the biggest leaves. Well, here's some out here that's pretty good size. Doesn't take long to get a fistful. I'm going to have to lay these down. That's a crop.
The other compounds are destroyed by heat and water together, like similar compounds that are in lima beans and kidney beans.
How's that for a mess of greens?
The important part is to cook the greens long enough. Pokeweed is not for eating raw. People can get very sick from eating raw or undercooked pokeweed greens.
Old wives' tales on this plant will scare you right out of your socks. We've been here 20 years, and this plant has been reaped at least 15. Healthy, really healthy plant. The healthier looking small leaves, there's medium-sized leaves. These are going to be super tender.
The roots and seeds of pokeweed plants have other compounds that are not broken down by heat or removed by water. The roots and the seeds are not for eating, and people do die, children and adults, from messing around with roots and seeds.
Give what's left over, get it all and ready to go to the compost bin. We won't have wasted anything. This, it'll rot away, bugs will eat it, decompose it, all kinds of goodies, and it'll just rot away, making good compost. So there you are. What's left of the plant, you could get a few little leaves. Here's the compost bin. I just lay it out there. Don't have to worry about it sprouting, it won't. So I'll put other things on it. It's going to decompose.
The first step in the kitchen is to treat those leaves right. In the summer heat, those leaves need to be cooled off. It's not enough just to put them in a sack in the refrigerator. My dad puts them in a sink full of cold water and stirs them around a little bit. This helps them rehydrate because they wilted a little bit after they got picked. He does keep the big leaves separate from those smaller and medium-sized leaves because they'll need to be cooked longer to become tender.
Okie doke.
Cooking pokeweed is not difficult. I could give you some simple directions, but I think it's more helpful to understand what you have to do to deal with the toxic compounds in pokeweed. The first set of compounds is water soluble, so the key is to cook the pokeweed in enough water. The water has to be boiling, and there has to be enough of it. So don't skimp on the water. Don't stuff a lot of leaves in a little pot. This pot is a tall stew pot. It holds 3 gallons of water. If you use a big pot with a lot of water compared to your leaves, then boiling the greens once is okay. It's important to remember that when the boiling is done, there's a lot of water still clinging on to those leaves when you take it out of the pot. That water has the toxic compounds in it, so that water has to get rinsed off and rinsed off well. And that's why you don't use that rinse water for anything, or that original cooking water that's left in the pot. It is not like pot liquor. It's not to be eaten or drunk as tea or used for soup. It's okay to put it in a compost pile or down the sink or on the grass in your yard. That's fine. Now, the second set of toxic compounds needs a full 10 minutes of temperatures that are close to boiling to break down. It's kind of like cooking kidney beans or lima beans, but for a shorter period of time. Using a dehydrator or the low setting on a slow cooker is not going to be hot enough. When you've gotten rid of both kinds of compounds, that pokeweed is ready to put in the freezer, or you can can it like any other greens, and it's not a big deal how you use those greens later. That's what the canning companies did. They boiled once for a long enough period of time and rinsed it off really well, and then you can open up their can and use the greens however you wanted. So when I look at all the different instructions that people have where they're changing the water and boiling 2 or 3 times and it seems like a lot of effort, I see that their goal is to make sure that the water-soluble compounds are gone. Maybe they're using a tiny cook pot. And when I look at the total amount of time that their greens are spending in water that's boiling or close to boiling, it usually adds up to at least 10 minutes. If you don't cook poke leaves in enough water, you can get a burning sensation in your mouth, like with other plants that have saponins in them, or if you're sensitive to quinoa at all. And if you don't cook the poke leaves long enough, you can end up with gastric distress, like if you are sensitive to kidney beans or lima beans. So I hope that helps explain now why and how poke greens get cooked the way they do. And I hope you won't think now that I'm being risky when I tell you how my parents like to cook their big poke leaves. I checked my camera's time clock. Those leaves were blanched only 4 minutes. They were rinsed really well, but still, they were only blanched 4 minutes. So how was that okay? The difference is because how they were cooked later. By simmering them with some raw onion and bacon for 50 minutes, that was more than enough time to break down that second set of compounds. We didn't trim out the big central rib, so they needed that amount of time just to get tender and let the flavors develop. And so you may say, hey, were those poke greens any good to eat? And I say they were absolutely delicious. I would have been proud to serve that to anybody. When I was there visiting, we ate pokeweed over and over at a lot of different meals. I never get tired of eating poke greens. And pokeweed greens are a great addition to a pot of other mixed greens that grow in the hot summer too. Day after day, I can eat pokeweed anytime. It's so delicious. It's really delicious. So it's a shame that you can't get canned pokeweed anymore. That would be the easiest way to get it and try it out, especially with that easy recipe on the back. But if you cook poke correctly, I hope you'll enjoy it as much as I do. It's incredibly good. So let's figure out a strategy to help you get to know pokeweed. I've put a good video on pokeweed identification on my playlist from the channel Identify That Plant. Go take a look at that video after this one is done, and then you're ready to go out and look for your own pokeweed. Pokeweed is in most of the United States and in southern Canada. The best pokeweed plants for eating are going to be in semi-shaded, nitrogen-rich soil. The best stand I ever found was beneath a big black locust grove in southern Michigan. It was incredible. Black locust is a nitrogen-fixing tree. I ate that pokeweed for months and months, every year. It was incredible, and I bet that stand is still there today. The best time to find your first pokeweed plants is when they're mature with their flowers and berries, not to eat, but for good identification. It would be really hard to mistake a pokeweed plant for something else when it's got those flowers and berries, and if you've watched that identification video on the playlist. When you find your pokeweed plants, go up and give them a good sniff. Pokeweed has a really distinctive aroma from the time when it's a small plant all the way through when it's mature. Now make a note of where that pokeweed plant is at, on a map or a GPS or just in a notebook. Then figure out whether that plant is in a good place for harvesting, in good, healthy soil. Pokeweed is a perennial, so once you find a good plant in healthy soil, you'll be able to go back to that same spot year after year after year and harvest your pokeweed. Pokeweed dies all the way back to the ground in the winter, but the vegetation takes a while to fall back down to the ground and decompose, so you'll be able to find even dead plants all through the winter and early spring. Just look for those big stalks standing up. In the spring, go back to those plants and look for the new shoots emerging from the roots. Those shoots have the least amount of toxic compounds. Even then though, don't eat those pokeweed shoots raw. They still have to go through some processing. You can try out the shoots in the early spring and see if you like them. It's a good way to get started. So just snap the shoots off or cut them off close to the ground level. But if you find a plant like this, be careful not to get any part of the roots. Eating any part of the roots can make you really sick. If your pokeweed shoots are in a sunny location, you can keep harvesting those shoots for 2, 3, or 4 times, just like you would asparagus. You want to make sure though that your shoots are staying in good condition and are thick and vigorous and get plenty of rain. You don't want them to be stressed. Or you can let those shoots go and harvest the early season leaves. The height of the plant isn't so important as the quality of the leaves. You want them to be actively growing. Think about the canning companies. They paid harvesters to bring in plants for a couple of weeks in early May in northwest Arkansas and eastern Oklahoma. People brought in plants that were almost knee-high with leaves that were fully open. That's because the canning companies didn't even use the shoots at all. They only used the open leaves. As the plants get older, you'll have to pay closer attention to the quality and condition of the leaves. The height of the plants isn't so important. It's the quality and condition of the leaves. If a plant looks stressed, let it go. Move on to something else. Shade-grown plants will last longer into the season, just like with other wild greens. You can prolong the harvesting from big, healthy, vigorous plants if you do what my dad did and cut big parts of the plant back to force new growth. If the weather is dry, that new growth may not be so good, so you'll have to pay attention. Stress changes the chemistry of the plant and not the way you want for eating. When a pokeweed plant stops putting real energy into new growth, then you're done. The chemistry of the plant changes again and not the way you want for eating food. In the fall, you may be able to trick the pokeweed plants by cutting all the vegetation down to the ground. The plants may put out another set of new shoots that you can harvest. Or you can do like my dad and keep all the berries and flowers cut off of the plant, and that way the plant will put the energy down into the roots for a bigger, stronger, and healthier plant over time. No matter what you choose to do, it's hard to overwork a poke plant. They are so vigorous and strong and flexible and adaptable, and they're such good food that I hope you really do get to know them and try them out yourself. I'm interested in hearing from you about your experience or questions or comments about pokeweed. I hope things are going well at your place. Thanks for watching. Bye.